I just want to introduce myself quickly. My name is Megan Roan. I'm a faculty member down at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Four Corners area, beautiful part of the country. And Melissa asked me to come up today to introduce our next speaker, and I'm very honored to be here to do this today for Jen Yazzie and allow everybody the chance to hear what she has to share today. Most of you know Jen already because of emails coming from her. If you were at the picnic and business meeting yesterday, you heard her honored, and also we got a little bit of a dating profile, so I'll stay away from that with introducing Jen. But yeah, I feel very privileged to introduce her here. I've known Jen since my first year as an academic back in 2015, 2016, and she was a student at Fort Lewis College at the time. I actually never had Jen in class, but had the privilege of working with her on some research work that we were doing related to needs of Native American students at Fort Lewis College. And Jen, I mean, you all know this already, but she impressed me super quickly. It was really clear then she has a strong research mind and a real passion for education and learning, and has not wavered at all in her goals in her education. And it's really exciting for me to be here to introduce her with what she's going to be sharing about and talking about today. She graduated, she left us, she went on to the University of Alaska in Anchorage, where I continue to be able to work with her on the project she is presenting today, which is her master's thesis, where she did some work and research with our students down in Fort Lewis. You will hear her results today, which are pretty tremendous and really, I think, bring a lot of knowledge to what we know about historical trauma, what it means for students. But what I don't think you will see quite as much of in her presentation is just how thoughtful her research design was, how thoughtful she was about things like informed consent, really looking at the relationship that she built with the participants that she is working with. So yeah, just really proud of the work she's put together here, and happy to hear her share that today. So Jennifer, come on up. Jen, Stephanie. We'll still have that. She's done a tremendous job giving voice to the experiences of the participants in her study, and I think you'll feel that.
Thank you so much. There it is. Yat she Jennifer Yazzie in she Kiani in shlo Kashchi Bashichin Ashihi Dashache Totsotni Dashanale. Hi, I'm Jen. And I was telling some people, because I feel like there's at least a good amount of you that have at least maybe heard me talk about this, or I've presented it at a couple different conferences. But surprisingly, throughout my time being here, I had never actually presented at SIP. And so some people had asked me earlier what I felt or how I felt about presenting today. And something that I really wanted to emphasize is that, I think because of the energy here, that this sort of talk that we're going to have today really focuses a lot on the journey and sort of what the process has been like, because I think that's what is most important. And so I'm not going to focus too much on the research specifics in a way, which I feel like can sometimes be pretty boring. But yeah, so this is a presentation on my master's thesis, which was titled Knowledge and Contemporary Effects of Historical Trauma on American Indian and Alaska Native People. Just to say along with that, there's some pictures in here, and they're just black and white photos of Dene people that I found, and I think that just sort of adds to sort of the aesthetic here. So yeah. So first, I'm going to start with sort of defining or talking a little bit about the way research sort of defines historical trauma. And so I first want to acknowledge that Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart sort of helped coin the sort of understanding of historical trauma and how it's defined in research. And I was very fortunate to have like a mini moment with her at the National Multicultural Summit back in January. When I found out she was coming to receive an award, I kind of had like a mini panic attack. And I feel like I've read so much of her work, and it was just incredible to see her in person and to hear her talk a little bit about the things she's been able to do and sort of this legacy that she has laid out. And so, historical trauma is defined by emotional and psychological distress throughout the lifespan and across generations resulting from substantial trauma experienced by a group. These sort of traumatic events look like things that we've talked about and things that we've heard. These things look like forced relocation, boarding schools, forced sterilization of Native women, rapid spread of diseases, community massacres, and illegalization of cultural and traditional practices, among other things that might come up in discussion or things that we already know about. So how is historical transmitted? It is transmitted in a lot of different ways. Some of the things that I have listed here are things like structural racism in the way of political and social disadvantages within societies, communities where cultural and traditional supports and ideologies were removed. And something that comes up a lot in historical trauma research is the historical trauma response. And so that looks like it's sort of defined as the negative coping strategies that Indigenous people and other groups of people experience, in which can look like substance misuse along with other things. And within historical trauma response research as well, it talks a lot about how alcohol was introduced to Native communities as well. So in sort of going forward with this thesis, I wanted to sort of reiterate the sort of impact of historical trauma. And so with that came a lot of looking into research that was done at the time, and sort of how other researchers had interpreted historical trauma, and so, or the impact of historical trauma. And so a lot of the research suggests that American Indian populations are consciously aware of the traumatic historical events. It's kind of specific to their tribe. I thought that was something that was really interesting. It was sort of like, in a way, we're kind of all aware of what this thing is, yet we don't really know what it is specifically in a way. I had read another article. Over half of the American Indian adult participants in this specific study thought about historical losses of their tribe, at least sometimes, and acknowledged that it caused them distress to think about those historical losses. So I think one of the big pieces, or sort of like one of the more apparent things that happened when I was sort of doing these interviews with students, while also working on my master's at the University of Alaska, the pandemic was running rampant. And that definitely had a big impact on what things were talked about during these interviews that I had done. And it also sort of impacted the way that I viewed this research. And it was very apparent that like COVID-19 is a big part of this, the historical trauma experience. And so I wanted to talk very briefly about some of the research that had come out relatively close to that time. Sort of this thesis kind of took many years. So some of this research sort of came out a little bit after like we had done interviews, but when I had done interviews, we had done them over Zoom because of the pandemic. And so American Indian and Alaska Native populations have infection rates over 3.5 times higher than non-Hispanic whites, and are over 4 times likely to be hospitalized because of the COVID-19 pandemic. I had read an article at the time that reported that American Indian and Alaska Native patients were significantly more likely to die in the hospital because of COVID-19 than Black and white patients. These social variability factors include poverty, lack of access to transportation and crowded housing. This sort of came up in the way that it was difficult to, right? Like I think the CDC and like all these other organizations were telling people you need to like wash your hands, you need to have access to water, you need to have access to soap. And a lot of places, in particular on reservations, there's still places that don't have running water, which then they can't protect themselves from the pandemic that was happening. And additionally, 54% of American Indian and Alaska Native people lived in rural and small towns and reservations where transportation is needed. I grew up on the Navajo Nation. I didn't grow up like in the ruralest areas, but it is pretty desolate in itself, and it takes 1 to 2 hours to get to the nearest store or to the nearest hospital. And so that seems really, really accurate. And it was something that we, in terms of me and my advisors, had talked about how important this sort of information is and how it fits a lot with the kind of research that I was doing at the time. Just quickly, I wanted to go over specifically mental health disparities among American Indian and Alaska Native people. So Evans Campbell found that the responses to the individual effects of historical trauma included symptoms kind of resonating with post-traumatic stress and depressive symptomology. I had read another article that examined historical trauma and its influence on psychopathology. And in the study, there was a correlation of symptoms associated with historical loss and anxiety and affective disorder and substance dependence. I have made this presentation like 15 minutes long as well as like an hour and 30 minutes long. So it's like I'm trying to like remember exactly the things that I want to like focus on today, but it's kind of hard given the time that we have. Ideally, I'd like to stay on time, but you know how that goes. So something that I wanted to focus on again is like why this research matters. This sort of research became a thing because I was going through this experience of learning about historical trauma, and it was a very confusing time. I didn't learn about it until I went to grad school. And when I learned about it, it just sort of created this ripple effect, which then led into the things that I became passionate about through in this way of like the things that I'm doing now. And something that I wanted to sort of reiterate is that this topic is very complex, and it has a lot of it's growing tremendously. I think at the time it was very difficult to find articles to even cite for my thesis, and definitely felt really compelled to try and add to that, and at least maybe influence others to also add to it. Something that I think is also really important, and there's a lot of research to back this up, is that it's really important for Indigenous researchers to be doing research with Indigenous people. There's this, I mean, we can talk about how important that is, and I think that comes in a lot of areas, maybe in the way of an Indigenous clinician working with Indigenous people. Something that I also think will sort of resonate in this is the telling stories is like a form of healing. And I'm so thankful for the students that I got to spend time with. We spent hours talking on Zoom about their experience of learning about historical trauma, and I'm so thankful for that. And there was a lot of healing that happened in that too. And so I wanted to make sure that that was very apparent when it came to like telling people about this research. Again, sort of in that realm of like with the pandemic, that historical trauma has a significant effect right now on current generations. And I think like letting them know that this is a thing is really important. And so sort of why I think this research matters. positionality was really important. I actually didn't add in a positionality statement until I met with Melissa for the first time. And I was at the time trying to finish up this thesis, but I was also a student here at Utah State. And she was like, "Oh, like, what do you think about a positionality statement?" I was like, "Oh, what's that?" And when she kind of explained to me what it was, and as I started to learn more about what a positionality statement is, I definitely wanted to put it in, and I wanted to sort of help the readers of this thesis to sort of understand where this is coming from and how me as a like I'm before anything else, I'm a human being, and I think the things that I've experienced have sort of definitely influenced how this research went and the process it's became now. I'm not going to read this because I feel like y'all have heard me talk about this at least once already somewhere at some point. Um, and so I just really wanted to put that in. So yeah, we'll go ahead and pass that one. Quick method stuff. As I mentioned, I have more slides about the whole thing, but I think more importantly, what I wanted to focus on is my students that I got to interview, and so I put here a little bit of demographic information about I call them my students, but um, I don't like calling them participants either. Like I feel like that's changed over time as I've been doing this work. And so they are all American Indian Alaska Native students. I was very fortunate to have Dr. Rona on my side, and she sort of helped me figure out how we could get students from Fort Lewis College, because I just think it was a perfect place to talk to students about historical trauma. And so all of them were sort of enrolled in a federally recognized tribe or village. This wording kind of became sort of difficult when it came to like the IRB process, which is a whole other thing. And I have another advisor that could tell you about how I basically had an argument with IRB about why this research mattered. They questioned me a lot about my sort of motive, and I ended up not making everyone cry, but everybody felt sort of how passionate I was about it. So that was a really interesting experience. And again, it was at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. In my thesis, we talked a lot about the history of Fort Lewis College and why it was also a big component as to why we wanted to talk to students there. They are, at least at the time, it's probably more now, but over 25% American Indian Alaska Native students go to school there. There's a tuition waiver for students. It has a history of being a boarding school, and it was also like an Army camp at some point. And so during the time we were doing these interviews, Fort Lewis College had sort of acknowledged their history in a way that I think was really important for students, and it had come up in interviews of sort of seeing this institution sort of take accountability for their history and actually tell the actual story of their history. I remember they had like a big ceremony, and they took down these plaques that were on campus that definitely told a very different story about the history of Fort Lewis College, and they took those down. And a lot of students talked about how important that was for them to have such a big institution acknowledge their history. And so that was also a big part of why we went with Fort Lewis College. And these are the tribes. As you can see, like more than half were Navajo Dene students, which makes a lot of sense. We're very close there. I mean, that's kind of why I went to school there. It was like 3 hours away. And so I also just kind of wanted to say that part. Yeah. I don't know how much time I have. Maybe I shouldn't worry. So I'm gonna go in. Okay. Uh, I'll go into the themes that came up that were most prevalent in the interviews that I did. I kind of look at these themes as sort of this journey And that's sort of the wording that I used in my thesis of sort of hearing the journey of these students talk about how historical trauma affected them and what they did with knowing that knowledge. And so we'll kind of go into each of these. And I have direct quotes from students that I wanted to share with you. And so I'll probably read those out because their words are very powerful. And sometimes we even became very emotional when we were talking. And so I want to make sure that I definitely acknowledge that and let them know that their words are very important. And so we'll kind of go into that. Just to give a little bit more background, so like how these themes became a thing or like how we define them. So the first one is sort of conceptualization of historical trauma. So it was sort of the way that we thought about it was expressed historical trauma to be deeply rooted among Indigenous people, in which the traumatic events of the past continue to have an impact on individuals and families and communities in the present. So participants described the traumatic experience as a specific type of trauma in which the dominant group of people inflict pain and hardship on another group of people. So I have a quote here from a student, and it says, "My understanding of historical trauma is something people feel that is intergenerational. It's something people feel because of colonialism and Indigenous people being stripped of their way of life and reintegrated into this foreign society. And because of that, there's always been a lot of different reactions to it. People were shocked and hurt and treated very poorly by the government, but that's sort of the idea." So I had asked them like, "Oh, how do you define what this is? Like in your own words, tell me how you think of what historical trauma is." And so one of the students said this. The next sort of theme that came from that was first learning. And I think this is something that's really important too, is that I wanted to know when they learned about historical trauma. Was it something they had learned about in their community? Was it something that was talked about at home? The term specifically had ever been used? Like, yeah, like where did you hear it from? And so essentially, all the students said they had never heard it at home. Never heard it in their communities. It was a term that was learned outside, more in particularly in an academic setting. A lot of them found themselves asking more questions about historical trauma and then delving into their own research to learn about it. One student said, in terms of like when they first heard about it, it was just a very brief discussion and then we kind of moved on from the topic. But after that, I was like, what does this even mean? So I did a little bit of research and watched a few TED Talks about it, but it opened my eyes and they sort of talked about a little bit more about what that meant. Another student said, "It wasn't until I read about it, I really started diving into education more, like I mentioned in my sophomore year. It wasn't mentioned in my first year. It was in my second year course of public health. My professor mentioned historical trauma, and I think that really kind of clicked within me that the reasoning behind why my community and my relatives and my people act, I think that's really first when it resonated with me." So to go into the next one, connecting past and present, that's essentially what it means. All participants sort of addressed the issue of alcohol misuse and mental health disparities in their interviews. A lot of students reflected on family members specifically who struggle with addiction, which they were able to sort of connect clearly to the negative impact of historical trauma. One student said, "I have close relatives that are dealing with issues, and I think that I have a lot of empathy for how I see the world. I've definitely been a lot more open in knowing that." And it was really interesting. I actually remember her saying this in particular, like she was kind of thinking about how to say this, and she was like telling this, and then she was like, don't get mad at your drunk uncle all the time. There's a reason behind it. There's a reason and point to how he got here. Sorry. It's emotional. I've always thought backwards to the point of where this stemmed from. So there was a couple of other students who also mentioned right? Like family members in particular who were struggling with addiction. And they were sort of seeing that that was connected to the historical trauma response. Another quote here from another student, it says, historical trauma definitely has a way of making me view the world differently. I move differently depending on where I'm at. Like when I'm back home, I feel comfortable around my people. But when I'm out here, like at school, it's just a weird thing in my head. Racism still does exist. And, experiencing some of that myself, I think that historical trauma was passed on to relatives and it influenced me to just keep an eye out for myself in the white man's world. I really like this quote. It's pretty long, but I think her words are really important. And so she said, I think we as Alaskan peoples are like others, resourceful, and we have a sense of community, but that's been pushed out to the side in the pursuit of the abuse that goes on in villages such as alcohol and sexual abuse. We have a lot of turmoil and it's being projected out through these horrible acts of violence against other Alaska Natives or violence against themselves through suicide. I feel like it's all connected with historical trauma and the way we feel kind of lost now because we lost where we were connected to. We lost that connection with either our language, our souls, with the earth, things that were taken from us when we were taken out of our homes and taught to live a different way. But we didn't really go to that side or stay in what we were used to and what we thrived in. We were kind of left in this middle ambiguity, and it really, really traumatized our people. So the next one, again, a part of this journey was talking and sharing. A lot of students sort of talked about how when they learned about historical trauma, they were like, oh, I gotta tell people, I gotta ask my parents about this. Like I gotta ask my grandma, my grandpa, like, do they know what this thing is? Which then led to a lot of students telling me specific stories of when they would tell their family members and like their grandpa tells them a story about them being in boarding school or sort of shares some sort of what they thought about that connection. Uh, and so one student said it's pretty regularly talked about in my family just because we're more open with things like this. I know a lot of people aren't, but we've talked about how like boarding schools and slavery, all of that has an impact today because it really wasn't that long ago. And my parents experienced it and their parents experienced it. I probably won't read this entire one, but I'll just sort of give you a gist of what this was. A student was talking about telling their grandfather about historical trauma. And when her grandfather had heard about it, he sort of started to talk about his experience of being in the boarding school. And then come to find out the boarding school was just across the street from where they were living. And that was something that she had never really heard before from her grandfather. So he had this traumatic experience at the boarding school, and the boarding school was just across the street. And so she sort of talked about that experience. Hurting and healing. This is also, I'm definitely over time, but this part, hurting and healing, I thought was really important to bring up because we had a lot of different emotional reactions to learning about historical trauma. A lot of students talked about being really angry, and that definitely resonated with me when I learned about historical trauma. I was mad, and I'm still mad. um, Being very angry, not just being really confused, being really sad. Again, these interviews were very emotional. I think when it came to this part in particular, uh, me and students were crying, talking about what this experience was like. And so they talked about, the student said, I get really angry, honestly, I get really angry and I feel very vengeful. I'm sad that my community is suffering from alcohol abuse because of historical events that brought in the alcohol and then gave us a reason to abuse it, from things like genocide, assimilation, our loss of culture, and our loss of language. Um, Another student, this was a Dene student, they had talked about how they didn't learn about they were upset because they didn't learn about historical trauma in the education system. And they had to wait a long time to learn about it. And it definitely started to make them, or the process was very upsetting. And it sort of led them to sort of want to continue to learn more. The last one that I wanted to talk about is empowerment and acceptance. And so I definitely, when it came to writing my thesis, I wanted to spend as much time on this because I think this is also very important. And it's sort of like kind of the thing at the end of the journey that sort of I guess in a way makes things a little lighter. It was sort of this like, okay, like knowing what you know about historical trauma, like what are you wanting to do with that? And every single student talked about how like they wanted to let their community know about this thing. They wanted to continue in school and finish school because they wanted to be public health workers. They wanted to go into psychology more. They wanted to be teachers because they wanted to tell their community more about what historical trauma is. Yeah, I probably won't read this, but again, it was just a student talking about realizing that like acknowledging that they were upset and they had a lot of important emotions associated with learning about historical trauma, but they were also thinking, okay, like, what am I going to do now? Like, what do I want to do with this? And so that's a conversation that we had together. When I first learned about it, it was constantly on my mind. And over the last couple years, I think about it every now and then. And the way it affected me is I feel motivated to pursue my education and bring what I can bring back to my home community, to try and give back to the community and back to the culture, and sort of like teaching the youth how to be immersed in their culture in a healthy way, along with them leading successful lives. I think about it more so in terms of learning experience rather than holding a grudge, if that makes sense. This student sort of talked about how their parents and grandparents lectured them about the importance of going to school, and they sort of were able to connect learning about this and continuing with their education as a way of sort of fulfilling what their ancestors and their parents and their grandparents sort of had laid out for them. So to sort of conclude everything here, just a couple things that I wanted to highlight in all of this is that all of these students didn't learn about historical trauma until they went to college, which is kind of crazy. And I also didn't learn about it until I went to grad school. And I think that should definitely change. And current generations are putting a lot of these pieces together, which is really cool. They're definitely talking more about what this is. I also think like the research is getting a lot better, and it's also helping with that. The same sort of consistent story was told throughout all of these interviews. And I think that really sort of is a testament to like what a lot of other students are experiencing as well. A lot of them feel compelled to sort of spread awareness, but also show their community and their family members compassion. And I think that was really important. And also showing themselves compassion too. And lastly, all of them were thinking about future generations. And I think that was so important. A lot of them talked about nieces and nephews and their own children and how they wanted to let them know that this is a thing and it's not their fault, that things are the way that they are and that they can do right, like do better and know that this is a thing, but still be successful and still have a like wonderful life, you know, in a way. And so I thought that was also really important to add here. Last thing I want to say is thank you to the incredible students at Fort Lewis College. Thank you for letting me tell your story and allowing me to tell your story in this way. And so thank you. That is it.
Hi. Oh, sorry. My name is Ella, and I'm really inspired by this project. I think this is amazing research. Like you said, it's greatly needed for future students who do want to be educated about this. I was wondering if you have anything to share about future projects you're interested in, or maybe
Like a
future.
dissertation?
Yeah, like for your future research, and maybe even making this a bigger project, I guess your next steps. I'm very excited to hear about that.
Which I feel like I've been hiding. Like people have been like, "Oh, what are you gonna work on now?" And I'm like, "Oh, I don't know yet." Um, I'm very thankful for Melissa because I think she helped me sort of make sense of this a little more. But something that we focus a lot in our lab is the importance of rest. And I brought this up at the retreat. I read a book called Rest is Resistance by Trisha Hershey. And in that book, she talks about how resting is sort of resisting against colonial structures. In a way, it's the way that you rest, you are able to reconnect with your ancestors. And in a way, you're honoring them. And I want to focus a lot on the importance of healing because I think healing can go a long way, and that can look it can look different in a lot of ways. And so I'm hoping to work on something around spreading more awareness about historical trauma, but also going in a direction of healing. And I have this vision of like a workbook or a manual or a website that can be easily accessible, that could be shared in a way. And I don't really know what that's going to look like yet, but I've seen examples of similar things, and I really want to focus on that resting aspect. And so I wholeheartedly believe that this historical trauma piece fits well into that, and I kind of see it going in that direction. Yeah, thank you.